Hi everybody. So in this video, I just want to talk a little bit about Jane Griffith's article. And I think this article will give us a little bit more information and insight into one aspect of the Indian residential school system in Canada, which was its attack on Indigenous languages and its sort of underwritten policy to promote English only as its sort of goal, to eradicate Indigenous languages and to promote English as a sole dominant language. So just before we start here, I'll just introduce the author here. So when you look at an article like this one, a journal article, so this has been published in a journal. The journal name is up here, Pedagogia Historica, and that's the name of the book or the journal that you could find this article published in. And there would be numerous articles published in one journal, so this is just one of them in that edition. So this is volume 53, issue number 6, and the year 2017. And then this is the page range of this specific article. So it goes from page 763 to 782. And then this long string of numbers is the DOI. So you could plug in this DOI and it would take you directly to the article if you just plug this into a web page. And this long string of numbers, that's just the DOI number. And every article that's published is assigned a specific or unique number, and it's just a way to, separate. It's almost like their barcode or something like that. Just a way to organize and catalog publications. And this would be like the publisher of the journal. The title of this article is Of Linguicide and Resistance, Children in English Instruction in 19th Century Indian Boarding Schools in Canada. So the focus here is on this idea of linguicide and also resistance through language. And this is a theme that's going to be popping up in some of the poetry and also our memoir reading of The Education of Agi Marasti. So this article has some relevance to the other course readings that we're going to be doing. The author, as I mentioned, is Jane Griffith. If you were going to cite this article, you would cite Griffith as the author's last name, and then also make note of whichever page number you are taking information from. So just to note, the page numbers are up here in the top corner. I've highlighted a couple of, I think, key passages in the article that I just want to bring attention to. So this is the abstract. So some articles will have an abstract, some don't. But this is just the short summary of what that article is about. It's a summary paragraph of what the author is going to argue. And in this article or essay, whatever you want to call it, the difference, I guess, would be an essay is unpublished, an article is a published essay. So you would be writing an essay in this class, but if it was to get published, you would have an article. So that's kind of the difference between those terms. So this would be an article. And Griffith is going to argue, so she says, I argue that school documentation represented English only rather than the more complicated understanding of English and English in addition to Indigenous languages. So she said, this distinction critically separates the policies of government and school from the beliefs of many parents and children who learned English for their own reasons, but not at the expense of another language. So she's kind of distinguishing English only versus English and or English in addition to. So if you think about when you acquire or are learning another language, you don't want to lose your original language. You just want to gain another language to add and become, multilingual or bilingual. So if you're English, you speak English as your main language and you learn French, you're not losing your English, you're just gaining another language. But Griffith is saying that, the residential schools, from the documentation that she's been reading from archives and old newspapers that were published in the schools, she's done a lot of research. She's saying from all this archival documents that she's found that the schools had rather an English-only policy or understanding of language. And they didn't want the students to gain another language. They wanted them to lose their mother tongue, their original language, and speak only English. So there's kind of a distinction there that she's creating. So she's saying the schools were determined to eradicate, destroy, sever the children's attachment or knowledge of their original language, indigenous languages, and replace it with English only. So that's not the way we teach English. Nowadays, we want to, if you learn English, you would learn it in addition to whatever language that you grew up with and that you speak as your mother tongue or your home language. So Griffith, she sort of introduces her essay here. So she's talking a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a little bit of history about residential schools. And she's narrowing her focus to specifically one of the mandates of the school, which was to eradicate indigenous languages. And she's saying this is also part of the larger colonial enterprise of residential schools, which again wanted to sever children from their families and communities and culture, assimilate them, and break those ties, and then also to access the land where indigenous communities lived. So it was also this larger colonial imperial expansion that residential schools are embedded in that master plan of the colonial settlers. So she introduces some ideas in this introduction, and one of them is, she talks about language as a kind of tool of colonialism, that it's about it's connected to a larger economic and political control of a territory. So language is a tool of the oppressor, a tool of the colonialists, and one of their goals is this idea of linguicide, so the killing of a language. So they would want to, destroy, exterminate a language, and sever ties also between the children as the younger generation and then older generations who spoke their indigenous languages at home. So that's the severing of cultural and familial connections, and it's also denigrating those indigenous languages, saying that they're less than, that they're inferior. And it's also about assimilation. So taking a group of children in this case and teaching them English and then using that as a way to assimilate them into dominant culture. So it is what she calls a settler colonial tactic, a literacy tactic. One of the consequences was, through the spread of English amongst residential school indigenous children in these schools, was to sever ties among generations. So when students returned home after years of separation, they could not speak with their families. So there would be this sense of alienation and isolation from their parents and grandparents who spoke indigenous languages, but now the children did not. So they become separate and isolated from the family that they once, felt strongly bonded and connected to. So in that sense, language is really important. It obviously, it creates continuity of culture. It connects families and communities together when there is that shared sense of language, shared sense of culture. The passing down of stories and histories happens through language and storytelling. So all of that gets severed and broken when a chain of, the lineage of a family or community gets broken off and can't understand those stories, languages, and culture anymore. So that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of language as a tool of assimilation. So yeah, she explains her thesis here, and you'll notice she uses I argue that, which, I mean, some professor would tell you not to use I pronoun in an argument, a thesis. But in this case, she's using it, and it is an effective tool. It's an effective way to write a thesis statement because it's clearly an argument. So I don't have that rule in my class or writing that you can't use first person. So when you're writing your thesis statement, you might try this kind of model and say, I argue that, and then state your argument. And I think that's a way to really clearly express yourself in your paper. So she argues that school documentation represented English only rather than the more complicated understanding of English and English in addition to Indigenous languages. So that's kind of what she's going to prove in the rest of her paper. So there's different headings. She has different sections to this article. And that's one way, instead of doing the 3-point structures we're typically, used to. Instead, she has sort of headings and sections. So she'll have 3 larger sections of her paper, and she's using headings to separate them. So the first heading, and then the second heading. So she'll use headings instead of paragraphs for this longer paper to sort of separate her main ideas. And then, yeah, just some interesting notes here. So she said the primacy of English has been codified in 1857 with the Act to encourage gradual civilization of the Indian tribes in the province, which held that an Indigenous man who could read or write either French or English would lose legal Indian status. So she's just referring to some historical government documents, and it just sets up this idea that if you could speak French or English under Canadian legal or government policy, you would lose your Indian status. So, Canada is founded on French and English colonies. And so those were the languages that were taught to Indigenous students in these schools, because those were the languages of the colonizers, settlers of this country. So a lot of the schools, she said, they never had a formal policy on language, but many at the local level, she said the majority of schools, Indigenous or Indian residential schools, had an English-only practices. So many schools focused solely on teaching English, and they had sort of a zero tolerance of students speaking their home languages, their Indigenous languages that they grew up speaking. And Indigenous peoples across Canada all speak different languages. There's a different, there's Cree and other Indigenous languages like Inuit and Ojibwe and other different Indigenous languages spoken in different territories all across Canada. But none of these, she said the majority of the schools had a sort of zero tolerance for students speaking any of their Indigenous languages within the schools. And in fact, a lot of the punishments would, target students based on if they were caught, whispering in their home languages, or, not speaking English in the schoolyard or anything like that. So she's looking at documentation from survivors as well. She's going to look at memoirs and other writings by Indigenous authors slash residential school survivors who talk about this topic of being punished for speaking their home languages. Um, Yes, so some indigenous authors, she's just noting here how the role of language in indigenous culture is very important, and as some indigenous scholars have noted, so Leanne Bedesamoke Simpson says our languages house our teachings and bring the practice of those teachings to life in our daily existence. So she's talking about, the passing on through generations of teachings, of cultural learnings and practices. And when that language doesn't get passed down, again, you lose culture, you lose those teachings, and knowledge doesn't get, transmitted from one generation to another. And Micmac scholar Mary Batiste says languages are how indigenous consciousness, cultures, literatures, histories, religions, political institutions, and values have survived and are transmitted. So she's linking language to the larger, institutions of culture and, including history, religion, spirituality, politics, values, all of that gets transmitted down through generations through language. So when a language dies, when it becomes extinct, when there is linguicide, you sever the transmission of all that cultural knowledge, and that can too, become extinct. So language preservation is at the very heart of cultural longevity and the existence and thriving of a culture from one generation to the next. So yeah, I highlighted a couple things here. Yeah, she talks about, settler colonialism, denying its violence, and creating a fantasy that students wanted to learn English, or that they readily, volunteered to give up their languages, and they don't acknowledge any kind of violence that's been committed through the act of the residential school system. So they promoted schools as a positive, and then hid or veiled the violence that was part of them. Not just the abuse that we have learned took place, but also the abuse and the violence of language denigration and disruption. So there's that. And so, yeah, she's saying, in addition to hiding the violence of English in public documentations, schools attributed the perceived inability to speak English to biology rather than schools themselves. So she's kind of talking about, she said students who didn't pick up English were viewed as inferior or not as intelligent, or sometimes blamed on their gender, like girls didn't pick up English in the schools as much as boys did, that kind of thing. So she's saying that the schools themselves blamed biology instead of, acknowledging that maybe some students didn't want to learn English or wanted to maintain their home language. So they viewed children who were resistant to speaking English as inferior, or as defective, or as rebellious and bad students, instead of viewing them as, trying to preserve their home language, their mother tongue, in addition to also speaking English. So some of those students, didn't want to lose their connection, their, traditions and culture, and also their language and ability to speak with their families and friends in their communities. So they wanted to preserve that, but maybe they also were learning English at the same time, but they weren't allowed to maintain or speak their home language freely. And yeah, so I highlighted a couple passages here. I'm not going to go through this article in a huge detail, but she does talk about how, yeah, some Indigenous students and some scholars, Indigenous writers today, recognize or see language as a form of resistance against the violence of colonial assimilation. And when we do study Augie Morasti's memoir, he'll talk about using, he'll speak in Cree when he doesn't want the nuns and brothers to understand him. So he'll speak Cree with his friends, and they'll, plan a little prank or something like that. So it's kind of this rebellious resistance to oppression and authority that was around them. So by holding on to your language, it was also, a form of resistance and challenge against the colonial oppression that they were living under. And okay, so I'm basically going to wrap it up, but you could read the full article. It is an interesting take on looking at language as a specific target of residential school assimilation policies. And it's specific to Canada, which is good too. Like, it does give us a little bit more insight. Sometimes residential schools get sort of, she talks about how the Americans' U.S. system is they had their own residential school system, and it's separate in its history and in its policies from Canada. So she's looking at Canada specifically. And she does connect her study with the larger calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that that sort of set up the call that today there should be an acknowledgement of the wrongdoings of language policies in Canadian government and in their treatment of Indigenous children in the school system. But it also, she says, it historicizes Indigenous people's resistance as well by trying to maintain ties to their culture, ties to their language, and preserving that despite efforts of the government and of the school systems, the authorities in the schools, to eradicate language, eradicate culture. There were those students who kind of held on to their language and fought for that in various ways. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about with this article. If it's an interest to you, this topic, again, you might think about exploring it in your upcoming assignment.